Picture the exact same African savanna, the exact same early human ancestors, the exact same evolutionary starting point, except this time, nobody ever figures out
Fire. No campfire. No campfires. No cooking. No warmth on a cold night. The entire story of humanity, and the question worth genuinely sitting with is this. Does civilization even happen at all without it? The honest answer, once as you actually dig into the science, is genuinely unsettling, and it turns out fire might be doing far more structural work in the human story
than almost anything else our species ever discovered. Let's start with the most obvious, immediate consequence, because it's also the most biologically important one. Without
fire, cooking simply doesn't exist. And cooking, it turns out, isn't just a convenience or a flavor upgrade. Researchers studying human Wrangham, through what's become known as the cooking hypothesis, have proposed that cooked food played a genuinely critical role in fueling the dramatic increase in
human brain size that separates us from every other primate on Earth. Cooking breaks down tough plant fibers and denatures proteins, making food dramatically easier to digest and allowing the body to extract significantly more usable calories from the exact same amount of raw ingredients. Wrangham's research suggests that without
this caloric boost, the human brain, which consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy despite being a relatively small percentage of body weight,
may never have had the sustained fuel source necessary to grow to its current size at all. Comparing humans to other large-brained animals actually reinforces just how unusual and energetically expensive the human brain really is. Elephants and dolphins, for example, both possess large, sophisticated brains, but neither species faced anywhere near the same caloric constraints humans did, since their raw diets already provided sufficient energy density without requiring any external processing technology at all. Human ancestors, by contrast, appear to have hit a genuine biological ceiling using raw food alone, one that cooking specifically seems to have broken through, which helps explain why brain expansion on the scale humans eventually achieved appears to be such a genuinely rare outcome across the entire animal kingdom.
Rather than a common evolutionary destination, every sufficiently intelligent species eventually reaches on its own. This alone,
cooking, humans might never have developed the specific brain capacity that eventually enabled language, complex tool use, abstract thought, and everything else that followed from.
We're not talking about a slightly less advanced version of human civilization in this scenario. We're potentially talking about a version of our species that never became cognitively capable of building civilization in any recognizable form at all. Let's also talk about digestion and jaw structure, because the physical evidence for fire's impact on human anatomy is genuinely visible in the fossil record. Comparing early hominin skulls to later Homo sapiens skulls reveals a consistent pattern: smaller jaws, smaller teeth, and a reduced digestive tract. Changes researchers believe directly correlate. Forcing this evolutionary shift, human anatomy likely would have remained closer to earlier hominin ancestors. Larger jaws built for grinding tough raw food, bigger guts.
Dedicating far more of the body's energy budget to digestion rather than freeing that energy up for brain development instead. In this fireless scenario, you're not just picturing modern humans without campfires. You're potentially picturing an entirely different physical body altogether, one that never had the evolutionary pressure to develop the smaller digestive footprint that made extra energy available for cognitive growth in the first place. Now let's move beyond biology and into pure, immediate survival, because losing fire doesn't just change long-term evolution, it changes every single night of every single life. Fire provided ancient humans with something genuinely irreplaceable: protection from nighttime predators. Anthropologists studying the deep history of human settlement patterns have pointed out that controlled fire likely served as one of
the most effective deterrents against large nocturnal predators. Lions, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, all of it.
Without fire, every single night for our entire evolutionary history becomes dramatically more dangerous, forcing early humans in
likely deep caves or elevated, harder-to-reach locations, and probably preventing the kind of confident, wide-ranging
on the planet. Migration itself becomes a genuinely enormous problem in this scenario. Humans successfully expanded out of Africa and eventually into regions with genuinely
harsh, cold climates: Ice Age Europe, Siberia, eventually across the land bridge into the Americas, and fire was absolutely essential to making any of that.
The human body, lacking thick fur or substantial cold-adapted biology, simply cannot
survive extended exposure to genuinely cold climates without some external heat source. This means Russia, Northern Asia, Canada, and much of the rest of the cold climate world might have remained essentially uninhabited by humans for a vastly longer stretch of history, if humans ever successfully settled there at all. Let's talk about metalworking, because this is where the fireless scenario genuinely collapses the entire trajectory of technological civilization. Every single metal tool humans have ever created: bronze, iron, steel.
I hate this! Why won't it light? Yes! Finally!
Bronze Age. No Iron Age. No swords, no metal armor, no metal farming tools, no eventual industrial machinery. Humanity would be permanently locked into some of the
Stone Age indefinitely, working exclusively with wood, bone, and naturally occurring stone, since there would be no possible pathway toward developing the
This technology needed to process any material requiring this cascades every genuine heat.
tools, which severely limits agricultural efficiency, which limits food surplus, which limits population density, which
Organized government. All things anthropologists and historians generally agree required agricultural surplus and dense.
One technology among many that humans eventually developed. It's arguably the single foundational technology that every subsequent technological advancement in human history was built directly on top of. There's also a genuinely fascinating social and cultural dimension to consider here, because fire likely played a significant role in shaping human
Social behavior itself, not just human technology. Anthropologists studying the social function of fire in hunter-gatherer societies for storytelling, teaching, and social bonding that daylight hours filled with hunting, gathering, and other survival tasks simply didn't allow for in the same way.
Some researchers have specifically argued that this extended evening social time around fire may have played a meaningful role in the development of complex language.
And oral storytelling traditions, since firelight provided the first reliable, safe conditions under which humans could gather together.
Survival tasks. Without fire, this specific evolutionary driver of social bonding, language development, and cultural transmission through date,
or at minimum, develops along a significantly different, slower trajectory. Light itself
dominated life before fire provided a reliable alternative. Without controlled fire, roughly half of every single day, every night for the entire span of human
existence would remain almost completely unusable for any activity beyond sleeping or huddling defensively in the dark.
It would be confined almost entirely to daylight hours, cutting the genuinely productive portion of ancient human life roughly in half compared to the reality actual ancestors experienced once fire became a reliable, controllable tool. Researchers studying sleep patterns in some remaining traditional societies with limited artificial light having found genuinely different sleep architecture compared to modern fire and electricity-saturated life, suggesting that even the presence of firelight
functional hours in a way that darkness alone never could have allowed. Medicine represents another genuinely serious casualty in this scenario. Boiling water, one of the simplest, most effective methods for reducing pathogen exposure available to ancient humans, becomes completely impossible without fire.
That require heat extraction, and even basic practices like cauterizing injuries to stop severe bleeding, all of these depend directly on access to controlled fire.
Without it, ancient human mortality from infection, waterborne illness, and untreated wounds would almost certainly have been significant
throughout actual human history, potentially placing an even more severe ceiling on population growth and life expectancy than what our species actually experienced. There's also
a genuinely important competitive angle worth considering, because humans weren't the only hominin species navigating this exact evolutionary landscape. Human relatives all shared the same general environment and faced many of the same survival pressures. Researchers studying the eventual dominance of Homo sapiens over
other hominin species have proposed that fire mastery, alongside language and complex tool use, may have provided a genuine, decisive competitive advantage in this crowded evolutionary landscape. In a scenario where fire never gets discovered by anyone, it's entirely possible that no single hominin species ever gains a decisive enough advantage over the others to eventually dominate and outcompete every other human relative, potentially resulting in a dramatically different, perhaps far more evolutionarily crowded and
rather than the single surviving human species story that actually unfolded. So where does this leave us? Let's try to genuinely picture this
fireless alternate timeline all the way through. A species that potentially never develops the brain capacity for complex language and abstract thought in the first place, due to the missing caloric boost from cooked food. A species confined almost entirely to warm...
A species permanently locked into basic stone and bone tools, with metalworking and everything technological that follows from it, remaining forever completely unreachable.
Inaccessible. A species facing dramatically higher nightly predation risk, more severe illness and infection rates.
Different trajectory of social and cultural development. It's worth being honest about the deep uncertainty here too, because we're discussing a genuinely hypothetical scenario that
reaches back to some of the very earliest chapters of human evolutionary history, and researchers studying these questions readily acknowledge the difficulty of definitively separating exactly how much of human cognitive and social development specifically required fire versus how much might have found alternative evolutionary pathways given enough time. But, the sheer number of independent, foundational human achievements that trace directly back to fire, cooking, brain development, migration.
Fire isn't simply one useful ancient discovery among many equally important ones.
It may be the single load-bearing discovery that the entire rest of human civilization was quietly built on top of. There's something genuinely worth sitting
And how completely invisible this dependency has become. Fire is embedded so deeply, so foundationally into human civilization that it barely registers as a discovery at all anymore, unlike, say, the wheel or writing, achievements we still explicitly credit and celebrate. Nobody wakes up thinking about fire as a
revolutionary technology, because every single visible layer of modern civilization built on top of it. Electricity, engines, industrial
the original foundation underneath. Removing fire from the human story doesn't just remove one chapter. It potentially removes the entire book that everything else was made. So what would have happened if humans never discovered fire? The honest answer is that the version of humanity asking this exact,
not a slightly less advanced civilization, not a delayed version of human history that eventually,
potentially an entirely different species altogether, smaller-brained, confined to warm climates, permanently locked into the simplest possible tools and facing a genuinely brutal, constant nightly struggle against predators and the cold darkness that fire has been quietly, completely eliminating from human life for hundreds of thousands of years. So thoroughly and so completely that most people alive today have never once had to seriously think about what the absence of that single
You know, I just don't think you realize what a true, monumental discovery would actually mean.